Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on virtual networking. Now in this course, being that it's Network Plus, we've learned about a whole lot of different networking concepts and ideas and tools and techniques and you name it. But the one thing we haven't really talked about a whole lot is the idea of something called virtualization. That's a real big buzzword right now in today's industry. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to talk about how to take a whole lot of the stuff we've already learned about in networking and see how it relates with virtualization. Let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about when we want to talk about virtual networking has to do with the idea of using virtual servers. Okay, and the idea of these virtual servers, I mean, it's pretty much what it sounds like, is that you can have multiple virtual servers on a single physical server, okay? Or to be more specific, I will tell you that here's what basically happens. You have a computer, and this computer, what would we typically do in the old days? We would install a server operating system, and we would run that server on that computer. The problem is that, and it's not so much a problem, I mean, it's wastefulness, it's not so much, is more so than being a problem, but basically the idea is that server, even when having it work real hard, we'd only utilize, let's say 20% of the resources that were on that computer. Okay, so, and again, that 20% is not an actual number, that's just a hypothetical. But, based upon, everything that one physical server could offer as far as the processing power and the amount of memory we have installed, the hard drive capacity and speed and all of that, we're only using 20%. And then when we want to have another server, well, we would just go ahead and buy another box, right? We buy another computer and we install a server operating system, and then that one would only use, we'll say, 20%. I mean, what a waste of resources that is. So now the idea is we have something called virtualization software, and this virtualization software has the ability to create what's called virtual machines, and these virtual machines exists on one physical box, and you do this by allocating a specific portion of the resources to that virtual machine. You can then take those virtual machines and install your server operating system there and create your virtual servers. So you take that one box that we'll say the server would only utilize 20% of the resources, and we could now create, let's say, 3 or 4 virtual machines on that box, which means we now have 3 or 4 virtual servers running on that one physical server. This way, we are utilizing closer to 100% of the resources that we spent our money on. Now, you never want to be at full 100%. That's something you still want to be careful of. I mean, if you're doing the math here, you might be thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. If each server only uses 20% of the resources, why not put 5 of these servers on that one box? Well, you never want to be at 100% because you want to have some kind of a buffer to make sure that, as things do get bigger and more powerful and are more heavily utilized, that you have room to grow. And then the other thing is you have to understand that the virtualization software itself and the underlying what's called host operating system also is going to need to have some resources available. The thing that is very cool about today's virtual servers, it hasn't always been this way. When virtualization was first introduced into the marketplace, there were a lot of limitations when working with your virtual machines. But I can tell you that in today's world, for the most part, virtual servers will have all the functionality of an actual physical server. It's just that you can have more than one of them on one physical box. So this is something that is very cool to how things work in the industry today. Now, the next thing, if we're going to talk about virtual servers, is we have to then talk about virtual desktops. Now, the easy way to explain a virtual desktop is to say, well, it's the same thing, right? You have your virtualization software and you have your virtual machines, but you install a desktop operating system instead of a server operating system. But here's the difference. The difference is, why would you create multiple desktop computers on a single box. I mean, if you think of the logic, it makes sense to have many virtual servers because the servers are just sitting in a room somewhere and they are just providing things to the rest of the network. Whereas the idea behind a desktop is, well, somebody is sitting at that desktop and actually working at it. Now, one of the original uses of virtual desktops was you might have multiple people who all sit down and share the same physical computer. Maybe they work different shifts, or maybe it was some kind of a kiosk type environment, and you'd have different people not just logging in as a different individual, but truly having their own virtual machine. What this has evolved into is the idea of having a centralized virtual environment, or what is sometimes referred to, and I'll tell you what, I have some key terms here, a VDI, a virtual desktop infrastructure. The idea is you might have these virtual machines, okay, so these computers, these massive servers that have all these virtual desktop environments, and then they are remotely delivered out to the various client computers. And that's another term that I'm going to throw out there, is something called a thin client. The idea is where you have a client computer that has minimal or no real resources of its own other than, we'll say, a monitor so that you can see things, a keyboard and a mouse so that you can navigate things, and a network card so that you can connect to the server that has the actual desktop. And then you see that desktop remotely delivered on your monitor. Now, this might sound familiar because if you go far enough back into the early days of computing, we used to have something called mainframe and then dumb terminals, where the dumb terminal was nothing more than a keyboard and a monitor, and there was no resources at all. Everything was being done at the mainframe. Well, we're heading back into that direction in the sense that we can have these thin clients, which are a lot like our old dumb terminals. Okay, so this is the idea behind virtual desktops. The next piece of virtualization technology that I want you to be familiar with is the term virtual switch. Now, here's the idea behind virtual switches. If you're going to have this virtualization environment with these virtual servers and desktops like we've been talking about, well, we also now, through the virtualization software, have the ability to create a virtual switch to go ahead and create our virtual LANs or our VLANs within that virtual environment. Okay, so it's actually a lot simpler than it sounds. So let's say we have one physical computer and it has enough resources for 20 virtual machines. But maybe you don't want all those virtual machines to be on the same network. Well, we can solve that by creating a virtual switch within the virtualization software to go ahead and segment the different machines over to different networks. And I can tell you that when it comes to connectivity from the rest of your network, well, those machines will be able to be accessed the same way as if they were truly being separated onto different segments with a real switch. Now, the next term is something that gets us into a whole different, a somewhat different arena. This is something called virtual PBX, which is a cloud-based PBX solution. Okay, now there's a term that we really haven't talked about yet, and that's the cloud, right? Everything is about cloud computing. And the idea is that you can have, instead of having actual PBX networking in-house, you can have your phones connect out to a third-party provider who will actually manage your company's phone network so that when people, let's say, call into your network and they hit a certain extension, what's happening is they're actually calling into that third party, and then that third party can reroute to the correct phone. Now, this is sometimes referred to as software as a service, or SaaS. Okay, it's the idea of a software solution where you pay a monthly fee and it's provided to you, the solution is provided to you as a form of a service. Okay, so that's virtual PBX. And along those same lines, we could then talk about something called network as a service, or NAS, N-A-A-S, which You'll never guess if software as a service is where you're being provided a software solution as a service. Network as a service is a cloud-based networking solution. Okay, so the idea here is you're paying a third-party provider to actually manage your network. Okay, so this is the idea behind virtualization, and this is where everything is heading. And when it comes to cloud computing, I can tell you that there's what's called on-site and then off-site, or what can also be referred to sometimes as a private cloud versus the public cloud. And what I mean there is you can have your own on-site private cloud computing. You can have cloud computing that is a VDI type environment where everything is managed from this centralized server room, okay, and you have this complete virtualized environment, but it's all still in-house. It's still within your own network. Or it could be off-site where you're truly going to a third party. There's many different companies out there where these virtual servers that I referred to near the beginning of this lesson can be provided to you from another company, and you access them across the internet. That's how you get to them. Okay, so really that's all we mean by on-site versus off-site, or private versus public. The public cloud means that you are going out to, some people think of public cloud and they think of, oh, that must be like the internet. Well, it kind of is. As a matter of fact, I will tell you there's a little bit of a gray area between private and public cloud, because even though you may be going out to a public third-party company to access those servers, it's still private in the sense that it's still secure and it's still your stuff, and only you can access it. So that's where there's a little bit of a gray area there when it comes to the terminology. But the simple way of thinking about it is you have your private cloud on-site versus public cloud computing would be if you're using a third-party off-site. All right, so that is really what you need to know when it comes to the different virtualization terminology, and more specifically when it comes to cloud computing, what we mean when we talk about on-site or off-site, or if you hear private cloud or public cloud. All right, well, that's a wrap for this lesson, and now you should understand how to not just network things, but virtually network things. And with that, I'll see you in the next lesson.